What historians now describe as the discovery that fundamentally altered our understanding of government surveillance operations began behind a false wall in a grieving widow's suburban garage workshop, all set in motion by one woman's attempt to rebuild her life after sudden loss, a chance finding that would eventually bring investigative journalists to her doorstep, trigger emergency congressional hearings, and ultimately expose decades of classified intelligence operations conducted against American citizens. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The metal shelving unit groaned under Rebecca Lawson's weight as she carefully dismantled it, a cordless drill in one hand and a crowbar in the other. At 46, the recently widowed high school physics teacher had become surprisingly adept at workshop organization, a skill born from necessity rather than choice. 4 months after her husband Daniel collapsed from a sudden heart attack during his morning run, ending their 18-year marriage, Rebecca was finally forcing herself to tackle the cluttered workshop that had been his sanctuary. The detached garage, converted into a meticulously equipped woodworking and electronics workshop, had been Daniel's pride and joy in their modest home in Pinecrest, Oregon. He'd spent countless weekends and evenings there, crafting furniture for their home and tinkering with vintage electronics, a hobby that had grown from his career as an electrical engineer at Western Communications Technologies, a defense contractor, with facilities scattered across the Pacific Northwest. "It just needs some updating and reorganization," the real estate agent had said when they'd first viewed the property 8 years ago, referring to the aging garage with its cracked concrete floor and outdated electrical system. What the agent had described as a minor project had become Daniel's obsession, transforming the space into what he jokingly called his laboratory, complete with custom workbenches, specialized lighting, and storage systems that Rebecca had never fully understood. The organization of. Now, as she systematically dismantled shelving units and sorted through boxes of components, Rebecca was discovering just how much of her husband she still didn't understand. Notebooks filled with cryptic diagrams and calculations, folders containing technical specifications for equipment she'd never seen in the workshop, and most puzzling, several locked metal containers that didn't match the open, functional storage Daniel typically preferred. "Mom, did you make any progress in there?" called her daughter Zoe from the doorway of the workshop, her voice bouncing off the concrete walls and metal shelving. "Just uncovering how much of a pack rat your father really was," Rebecca replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I found at least 3 different soldering stations and enough electronic components to build a small spaceship. Dad always said you never knew when something might come in handy." Zoe smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. At 19, home from her first year of college for the summer, she'd been trying to balance supporting her mother with processing her own grief. "How's the scholarship application coming along?" Rebecca asked, setting down her tools and stretching. Her back stuck. "The essays are killing me," Zoe sighed. "Engineering programs want technical precision, but also authentic personal voice, whatever that means." Rebecca nodded sympathetically. Daniel's death had thrown more than their emotional lives into turmoil. His life insurance had covered immediate expenses, but with college costs mounting and Rebecca's teacher's salary stretched thin, financial concerns were becoming increasingly pressing. The scholarship Zoe was applying for could make the difference between continuing at her prestigious engineering program and transferring to a less expensive state school. "I'll help you brainstorm after dinner," Rebecca promised. "Just need to finish clearing this wall so I can patch those cracks in the foundation." As Zoe retreated back to the house, Rebecca turned her attention to the final shelving unit against the far wall. Unlike the others, this one appeared to have been anchored directly into the wall itself rather than freestanding. It had always been packed with boxes of old technical manuals and parts catalogues, items rarely accessed but apparently too valuable to discard. With the shelves now empty, Rebecca could see something odd about the wall behind them. The workshop's walls were finished with painted plywood panels, but this section seemed different, the texture slightly off and the color not quite matching the surrounding walls. Running her hand along the seam where the shelving met the wall, she felt a slight gap that seemed intentional rather than the result of settling or poor installation. "That's strange," she murmured, crouching to examine the base of the unit more closely. The heavy-duty brackets anchoring it to the wall seemed excessive for mere storage shelves, almost as if they were designed to secure something more substantial. Using her drill, Rebecca carefully removed the brackets, expecting the unit to pull away from the wall. Instead, it remained firmly in place. Her curiosity now fully engaged, Rebecca inspected the sides of the unit more carefully, noticing subtle hinges cleverly disguised along the left edge. This wasn't just a shelving unit, it was a door. With growing excitement mixed with confusion, Rebecca wedged her crowbar into the barely visible gap along the right edge and applied gentle pressure. The shelving unit gave slightly, revealing darkness behind. Working methodically, she managed to release a hidden latch mechanism, and the entire unit swung outward like a door, moving with surprising ease for its size and weight. "What in the world?" she whispered, reaching for her phone to use its flashlight. The beam revealed a small, hidden room, approximately 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, extending behind the workshop wall into what should have been unusable space between the garage and the property line. The room was lined with metal shelving containing neatly labeled banker's boxes and what appeared to be electronic equipment covered in dust cloths. A small desk with a locked filing cabinet occupied one corner, a chair pushed neatly against it as if its occupant had just stepped away momentarily. Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities, a private workspace for projects Daniel didn't want cluttering the main shop, a secure storage area for valuable equipment. But why the hidden door, disguised as a shelving unit? Why not just tell her about it? The past 4 months had taught Rebecca resilience she never knew she possessed. Daniel's death had left her emotionally devastated and facing an uncertain financial future, with a daughter in college and a mortgage that had been calculated based on 2 incomes. Friends had questioned her decision to stay in the house with its painful memories rather than downsizing to something more manageable. But Rebecca had been determined to provide stability, to maintain the home where they had built their lives together, where Zoe had grown up and still returned to during school breaks. The house required constant attention, repairs and maintenance that Daniel had always handled. Rebecca had thrown herself into learning these skills, watching online tutorials and consulting with more knowledgeable friends. The workshop renovation represented her latest attempt to reclaim the space, transforming it from Daniel's domain into something functional for the household. Perhaps a studio she could rent out for additional income, or workspace where she could develop the hands-on physics demonstrations she used in her classroom. Setting her phone to illuminate the space, Rebecca stepped into the hidden room, immediately noticing the cooler, drier air compared to the main workshop. A dehumidifier sat in one corner, still plugged in but apparently no longer functioning. The walls were lined with what appeared to be thin metal sheeting beneath the painted surface, unusual for a simple storage space. The desk drew her attention first. Its surface was clear, except for a framed photograph she recognized, Daniel with his colleagues at a company event several years ago. She tried the filing cabinet drawer, finding it locked with no obvious key in sight. Moving to the shelves, Rebecca examined the banker's boxes. Each was labeled with a simple alphanumeric code, WCTSC 2010Q3. Pro-J Helios Data, Sentinel Com Logs. The technical-sounding labels meant nothing to her, but the careful organization was unmistakably Daniel's work. Selecting one of the boxes labeled Personal DL Contingency, Rebecca carefully lifted it down and placed it on the desk. Unlike the others, this one's label suggested content that might make sense to her. The box was sealed with packing tape that had yellowed slightly with age. Using her car keys, she scored along the tape and opened the lid. Inside, she found several sealed envelopes, a small fireproof document box, and a leather-bound journal. The top envelope was labeled simply Rebecca in Daniel's precise handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My dearest Rebecca, the letter began. If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you've discovered this room. I hope you never have to read these words, but I've learned enough about how our world really works to know that hope is not a strategy. The letter continued for several pages, Daniel's voice so clear in the written words that Rebecca could almost hear him speaking them. He explained that his work at Western Communications Technologies had led him to discover classified information about government surveillance programs targeting U.S. citizens, programs that went far beyond what had been disclosed to Congress or the public. "I'd never intended to become a whistleblower," he wrote. "I believed in the mission of protecting our country, but what I discovered wasn't about national security. It was about control, about powerful people using the machinery of government to track political opponents, journalists, activists, anyone they deemed threatening to their interests." According to Daniel's letter, he had spent years carefully documenting these programs, gathering evidence from internal communications, technical specifications, and operational logs. The boxes in this room contained that evidence, systematically organized, annotated, and preserved. "I didn't tell you about this because I wanted to protect you and Zoe," the letter continued. "What I've done would be considered treason by some, patriotism by others. I couldn't put that burden on you without your consent, but if something has happened to me, you need to know. The truth needs to be protected." The letter concluded with detailed instructions about people Daniel trusted, a journalist at the Oregon Sentinel named Maya Chen, who had reported on government surveillance in the past, and a civil liberties attorney in Portland named James Harrington, who had connections to privacy advocacy organizations. "Trust your instincts, Rebecca. You're smarter and stronger than you've ever given yourself credit for. Whatever you decide to do with this information, I trust you completely. All my love, always, Daniel." Rebecca sat back, the letter clutched in her hands, her mind struggling to process its implications. Daniel, her methodical, rule-following husband who dutifully filed their taxes early every year and insisted on respecting the maximum occupancy signs in elevators, had been secretly documenting classified government operations for years. It seemed impossible, completely disconnected from the man she thought she knew, yet the evidence surrounded her in this meticulously organized secret room. This was undeniably Daniel's work, his handwriting, his organizational system, his thoroughness, evident in every labeled box and folder. As she tried to make sense of this revelation, Rebecca's phone chimed with a text from Zoe. "Mom, dinner's ready whenever you are. Should I come help you finish up?" "Be right there," Rebecca replied. Suddenly aware of how long she'd been in the workshop, she carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it back in the box. Whatever decision she needed to make about Daniel's discovery, she needed time to think first. This wasn't just about her. It would affect Zoe as well, potentially, in ways that could change their lives forever. Rebecca closed the hidden room, carefully swinging the shelving unit back into place and temporarily securing it. She would need to examine the contents more thoroughly before deciding what to do, but not tonight. Tonight, she needed to process what she'd discovered about the man she thought she'd known completely. Over dinner, Rebecca struggled to maintain. Normal conversation with Zoe, her mind constantly returning to the hidden room and its shocking contents. Had Daniel really uncovered government programs spying on American citizens? If so, what had happened to those who knew about his discovery? His heart attack had seemed natural, sudden, but not entirely surprising given his family history of cardiovascular problems. Was it possible there was more to the story? "Mom, you're a million miles away," Zoe observed, setting down her fork. Did something happen in Dad's workshop? Rebecca hesitated. Should she tell Zoe about the hidden room, about Daniel's letter? Her daughter was intelligent and level-headed, but this information carried risks. Daniel had kept it secret to protect them. Was sharing it with Zoe putting her in danger? "Just found some old projects of your dad's that brought back memories," Rebecca replied, deciding to wait until she better understood what they were dealing with. "He was always working on something I didn't quite understand." Zoe smiled. "Remember when he tried to explain circuit design to us at dinner that time? You said it was like he was speaking Martian." The memory lightened the moment, and Rebecca managed to redirect the conversation to Zoe's scholarship application, offering to review her essays after dinner. They spent the evening working on applications, the normalcy of the task providing. Rebecca with temporary distraction from the life-altering discovery in the workshop. Later that night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Rebecca returned to the hidden room with a battery-powered lantern for better light. She examined the space more, methodically this time, noting details she had missed in her initial shock. The metal lining the walls appeared to be a form of RF shielding, designed to block electronic signals from entering or exiting the space. A dead plant in the corner suggested Daniel had spent significant time here trying to make the secret workspace more comfortable. She turned her attention to the banker's boxes, selecting one labeled WCT Overview Sentinel. Inside, she found carefully organized folders containing what appeared to be technical documentation for a surveillance system codenamed Sentinel. The documents detailed capabilities that sent chills down Rebecca's spine: real-time monitoring of phone communications, email scanning algorithms, social media analysis tools, and location tracking systems, all apparently deployed domestically without warrants or oversight. Many of the documents bore government classification markings: confidential, secret, and even several labeled top secret. Some were on Western Communications Technologies letterhead, while others appeared to be from various government agencies, including some with Department of Defense and National Security Agency headers. Rebecca's hands trembled as she realized the significance of what she was holding. If authentic, these documents revealed domestic surveillance operations far beyond anything publicly acknowledged by the government, potentially illegal programs, operating without proper congressional oversight or judicial approval. Another box contained what appeared to be internal communications, emails and meeting notes discussing the implementation and expansion of these surveillance programs. Names of government officials appeared alongside corporate executives discussing targeting parameters and collection priorities with disturbing casualness. Some communications specifically mentioned monitoring environmental activists, anti-war groups, and journalists investigating government contractors. The final box, Rebecca examined that night, contained what appeared to be Daniel's personal research and analysis. Notebooks filled with his precise handwriting detailed connections between surveillance programs and specific government actions against targeted individuals, tax audits that followed political activism, career setbacks for government employees who raised ethical concerns, journalists whose sources mysteriously disappeared after they began investigating certain topics. Daniel had been thorough, cross-referencing public information with the classified material he had access to, building a comprehensive picture of surveillance being weaponized against American citizens. The evidence was damning and meticulously Documented, exactly the kind of work she would have expected from her methodical husband. As the night deepened, Rebecca found herself at a crossroads. Daniel's letter had included names of people he trusted, but contacting them meant committing to a path that could completely upend her life and Zoe's. Whistleblowers faced serious consequences: legal jeopardy, public scrutiny, professional destruction. Even if she remained anonymous, exposure of this information would inevitably lead investigators to Daniel's work at Western Communications Technologies, which would eventually lead to her. Yet the alternative, remaining silent about programs that violated Americans' constitutional rights, seemed equally impossible to accept. Daniel had risked everything to document these abuses. Could she simply reseal the room and pretend she'd never found it? Around 2 a.m., exhausted but too wired to sleep, Rebecca carefully returned the materials to their boxes and secured the hidden room. She needed more time to think, to develop a plan that would honor Daniel's work while protecting herself and Zoe. As much as possible. As she finally prepared for bed, Rebecca realized that her understanding of her husband had fundamentally shifted. The man she thought she knew completely had carried this enormous secret throughout their marriage, working alone in this hidden room while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary engineer and family man. The deception should have felt like betrayal, but instead, Rebecca found herself filled with a complex mixture of pride, grief, and resolve. Daniel had uncovered something dangerous and important. He had acted out of principle, at great personal risk. Whatever she decided to do with his discovery, Rebecca was determined that his courage would not be wasted. The truth he had sacrificed. So much to document deserved to be protected, and perhaps, when the time was right, revealed. As she drifted toward sleep, Rebecca thought about the scholarship essays she'd been helping Zoe with earlier that evening. One prompt had asked about ethical challenges in engineering, a topic that now seemed devastatingly relevant. Daniel had faced the ultimate ethical challenge in his profession and had chosen truth over comfort, risk over safety. That legacy was now in her hands, a responsibility she had never sought, but could not ignore. Tomorrow, she would begin examining the evidence more systematically, trying to understand exactly what Daniel had uncovered and what risks exposing it might entail. For tonight, she needed rest and clarity. The path forward would require all the strength and intelligence she possessed, qualities Daniel had always insisted she had in abundance, even when she doubted herself. Whatever came next, Rebecca knew her life had fundamentally changed the moment she discovered that false wall. Like Daniel before her, she now carried knowledge that could not be unlearned and responsibility that could not be abandoned. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to act in a way that would protect what mattered most, while honoring the truth her husband had sacrificed so much to document. The next morning, Rebecca woke before dawn, her mind still churning with the implications of what she'd discovered. The documents in Daniel's hidden room represented more than just classified information. They were a moral challenge, a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. As she prepared coffee in the kitchen's pre-dawn stillness, Rebecca's physics teacher mind automatically categorized the problem: mass, velocity, momentum, impact. The information had mass, substantial and weighty. Once set in motion, it would create momentum that couldn't be easily stopped, and the impact, potentially explosive. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep either," she asked, reaching for a mug. "Just thinking about all the work waiting in Dad's shop," Rebecca replied, not quite a lie, but far from the complete truth. "You're up early for summer break." "Meeting my research advisor online at 7. Time zones." Zoe shrugged, pouring coffee. "She's in Zurich for a conference." Rebecca studied her daughter, brilliant, focused, so much like Daniel in her methodical approach to problems. At 19, Zoe stood at the threshold of a promising career in engineering, following her father's professional footsteps while blazing her own trail. How would the contents of that hidden room affect her future if Rebecca decided to make them public? After Zoe retreated to her room for her meeting, Rebecca returned to the workshop, securing the door behind her. The morning light streaming through the high windows, illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, giving the space an almost ethereal quality. The secret room behind the shelving unit waited, its contents a time bomb of information that could shake public confidence in government institutions already suffering from historically low trust. Rebecca swung open the hidden door and set to work with scientific precision, creating an inventory of the documents Daniel had collected. She categorized files by program name, government agency involved, and apparent level of legal authorization. Her teacher's laptop, used primarily for creating lesson plans and grading, became a secure digital repository as she photographed key documents and created an organizational system that mirrored Daniel's meticulous approach. By mid-morning, patterns emerged from the chaos. The surveillance programs Daniel had documented appeared to operate under the umbrella designation Project Sentinel, with various subcomponents focusing on different communication channels and target groups. Western communications technologies had developed the technical infrastructure, hardware and software tools that could intercept, store and analyze vast amounts of data from everyday Americans' digital communications. The most disturbing documents detailed how these capabilities were being deployed against specific groups. Environmental activists opposing pipeline projects, journalists investigating defense contracts, civil liberties attorneys challenging, government surveillance authorities, and even academics whose research questioned prevailing national security narratives. A folder labeled Domestic Targeting Criteria contained internal communications discussing how to identify and monitor potential domestic threats using alarmingly broad parameters. Having attended more than 3 protests in a 6-month period, qualified someone for enhanced monitoring. Using encryption tools or privacy-focused browsers triggered automatic flagging. Even certain search terms and reading habits could place Americans on watch lists that subjected them to increased surveillance. "This can't be legal," Rebecca murmured, photographing a memo that explicitly acknowledged the program operated in a gray area relative to Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. The most recent documents dated from approximately 8 months before Daniel's death, around the time he had begun experiencing what he had described as stress-related health issues. His doctor had attributed his symptoms, insomnia, anxiety, elevated blood pressure, to workplace pressure and family history. Now Rebecca wondered if the stress had stemmed from the knowledge he was carrying and the decisions he faced about what to do with it. A file labeled Personal Contingency Contact contained detailed information about the people Daniel had mentioned in his letter. Maya Chen, the journalist at the Oregon Sentinel, had published several well-researched articles on government surveillance overreach. James Harrington, the civil liberties attorney, had successfully litigated cases challenging aspects of government surveillance programs. Daniel had clearly researched them carefully before deciding they could be trusted. The file also included a name Rebecca didn't recognize, Dr. Eleanor Weiss, professor of constitutional law at Lewis and Clark Law School. Notes in Daniel's handwriting indicated he had attended a public lecture Dr. Weiss had given on privacy rights in the digital age and had been impressed by her expertise and ethical framework. He had apparently never contacted her directly, but had identified her as someone who might provide valuable guidance if needed. As Rebecca continued her inventory, a sharp knock at the workshop door startled her. She quickly secured the hidden room and composed herself before opening the door to find a man in his early 50s wearing a Western Communications Technologies polo shirt. "Mrs. Lawson, I'm Philip Mercer. I worked with Daniel in the Advanced Systems Division." He extended his hand with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope I'm not intruding. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing." Rebecca shook his hand, instantly on guard. In the 4 months since Daniel's death, none of his colleagues had been in the neighborhood of their suburban home, located a good 30 minutes from the WCT campus. "That's very thoughtful," she said, maintaining a neutral expression. "We're managing as well as can be expected." "I see you're working on Daniel's shop," Mercer observed, glancing past her at the partially dismantled workbenches and sorted tools. He was always so proud of this space. Talked about it all the time at the office. "Yes, I'm finally getting around to organizing things," Rebecca replied. "Did you need something specific, Mr. Mercer? I'm in the middle of a project." "Actually, I was hoping to pick up some work materials that might have ended up here," he said smoothly. "Daniel occasionally brought technical documentation home to review, and our security team is conducting an audit of all project materials. Standard procedure when we lose a team member, I'm afraid." The calculated casualness in his tone sent warning signals through Rebecca's mind. This was no coincidence. Something had triggered this visit. Perhaps digital security systems in the hidden room that had activated when she'd entered it, or tracking software on some of the documents she'd photographed. "I haven't come across any work materials," she said truthfully, as the documents in the hidden room weren't items Daniel had occasionally brought home, but part of a systematic documentation effort. "But if I do, I'll be sure to contact the company." Mercer's smile tightened slightly. "Perhaps I could take a quick look around, save you the trouble of identifying what might be company property. Some of the documents would look like ordinary technical specifications to someone without context." "I'm afraid that's not convenient right now," Rebecca said firmly. "As I mentioned, I'm in the middle of a project, and I have a strict timeline I'm working with. If you'd like to leave your card, I can contact you if I find anything that appears work-related." The standoff lasted only seconds, but Rebecca could feel the calculation happening behind Mercer's eyes, weighing the cost of pushing harder against the benefit of maintaining the pretense of a friendly visit. "Of course," he finally said, extracting a business card from his wallet. "Please do call if you come across anything. Some of these materials could be quite sensitive, government contracts and all that. We wouldn't want to inadvertently create any security concerns for you or your daughter." The subtle threat in his last sentence was unmistakable. Rebecca accepted the card with steady hands, thanked him for his concern, and firmly closed the workshop door as he departed. Through the small window, she watched him return to a black sedan parked on the street and make a call before driving away. The encounter crystallized the danger in a way the documents themselves hadn't fully conveyed. Daniel's former employers were actively looking for the information he had collected. They knew enough to send someone to check the workshop specifically. And they weren't above using thinly veiled threats against her family. Rebecca's timeline had just accelerated dramatically. Whatever she decided to do with Daniel's discovery, she couldn't keep the documents in the house any longer. She needed expert advice and secure storage for the information, preferably before Mercer or his colleagues returned with more formal pressure. Returning to the hidden room, Rebecca worked quickly, selecting the most significant documents to digitize while preparing the physical materials for transport. Daniel had included detailed instructions in his contingency files for contacting his recommended allies securely, including encryption tools and communication protocols designed to minimize digital footprints. Following these instructions, Rebecca composed a carefully worded email to Professor Eleanor Weiss, requesting a consultation on a legal matter involving government surveillance documentation without including specific details that might trigger monitoring systems. She used the secure email service Daniel had recommended, accessing it through a privacy-focused browser on a prepaid laptop she used for workshop inventory, a device that had never been connected to her home network or personal accounts. While waiting for a response, Rebecca continued photographing key documents, encrypting the files using the tools Daniel had provided. By early afternoon, she had created a comprehensive digital archive of the most significant materials, evidence of unconstitutional surveillance that could not be easily destroyed or suppressed if the physical documents were seized. A response from Professor Weiss arrived within hours, brief and cautious. "This matter requires in-person discussion. My office, Lewis and Clark Law School, tomorrow at 2 p.m. No electronic devices." Rebecca quickly confirmed the appointment, then turned her attention to securing the physical documents. Daniel's contingency plans had included provisions for this scenario as well, instructions for creating a weatherproof, tamper-evident package, and a recommendation for temporary secure storage at a private vault service in downtown Portland, one that required only cash and minimal identification. Working methodically through the afternoon, Rebecca prepared the most sensitive materials for transport, dividing them between 3 secure packages, as Daniel had suggested, distributing the risk while ensuring that each package contained enough context to understand the significance of the information. The remaining documents she returned to their original boxes, but moved them from the hidden room to various locations around the house and garage, disguised as ordinary storage. As she worked, Rebecca's mind kept returning to Philip Mercer's visit and its implications. Western communications technologies knew something was missing. They were worried enough to send someone to her home on a Saturday. The company's connections to government security agencies, detailed in Daniel's documents, suggested they might have access to surveillance tools and legal authorities that ordinary corporations would not. By the time Zoe returned from meeting friends for lunch, Rebecca had completed the most critical preparations. The digital archive was secured on encrypted drives, hidden in locations that appeared innocuous, inside a hollowed-out physics textbook, disguised as an external backup. Drive for her lesson plans, concealed within a false bottom in her toiletries case. The physical document packages were sealed and ready for transport to the private vault service when she traveled to Portland the next day for her meeting with Professor Weiss. "Everything okay, Mom?" Zoe asked, finding Rebecca in the kitchen, preparing dinner with unusual intensity. "You seem focused." "Just thinking about some physics demonstrations I want to develop in the workshop space," Rebecca replied, the cover story she'd prepared coming easily. "I might drive up to Portland tomorrow to check out some materials at that specialty science education supplier." "On a Sunday?" Zoe raised an eyebrow. "They're having a summer clearance," Rebecca improvised. "Thought I might take advantage of the discounts for next year's classes." Zoe seemed to accept this explanation, but Rebecca caught her daughter, watching her with a thoughtful expression several times during dinner. Daniel had often said that Zoe had inherited Rebecca's intuition along with his analytical mind, a combination that made her perceptive to subtleties in human behavior that others might miss. After dinner, as they cleared the dishes together, Zoe finally spoke the concerns Rebecca had seen building. "Mum, is something going on? And don't say, just physics demonstrations again. You've been different since yesterday, distracted, intense. And that guy who came by today, I saw his car from my window. He sat there making calls for 10 minutes after leaving." Rebecca set down the plate she was rinsing and turned to face her daughter. She'd planned to keep Zoe completely insulated from the situation until she'd consulted with Professor Weiss, but she recognized the determined expression on her daughter's face. the same one Daniel had worn when he wouldn't be deflected from an important question. "I found something in Dad's workshop," Rebecca admitted carefully. "Something complicated that I'm still trying to understand. I'm getting some expert advice tomorrow before deciding what to do next." "What kind of something?" Zoe pressed. "Information," Rebecca said after a pause. "Potentially sensitive information related to Dad's work. That's all I can say right now, Zoe. Not because I don't trust you, but because I don't fully understand the implications myself yet." Zoe studied her mother's face, clearly weighing whether to push further. "Does it have anything to do with those weeks when Dad was so stressed last year, when he was having trouble sleeping?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "I heard him in the garage late at night sometimes when I was up studying. He wasn't building anything, no power tools running, just there, for hours. And he'd check his phone constantly like he was waiting for something important. It wasn't like him." Rebecca nodded slowly, recalibrating her understanding of the timeline. Zoe had noticed changes in Daniel's behavior that Rebecca had attributed to work pressure. Her daughter had been more aware than she'd realized. "It might be connected," Rebecca acknowledged. "I'm meeting someone tomorrow who can help me understand what I've found. After that, I'll be better able to explain." Zoe seemed to accept this partial answer, though her expression remained concerned. "Just be careful, okay? That guy today gave me a weird feeling." "I will," Rebecca promised, touched by her daughter's perceptiveness and protective instinct. "And Zoe, until I figure this out, maybe don't mention to anyone that I'm going to Portland tomorrow. Let's keep that between us." The seriousness in her tone wasn't lost on Zoe, who nodded slowly. "Okay, but you'll tell me what's going on when you can." "As soon as I understand it myself," Rebecca assured her. That night, Rebecca barely slept, her mind cycling through scenarios and contingency. Plans. Daniel's hidden archive had transformed their lives in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. Responsibility to the truth, to Daniel's memory, to Zoe's future, and potentially to the constitutional rights of countless Americans affected by the surveillance programs documented in those files. By morning, Rebecca had resolved that whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and integrity that had driven Daniel to create his archive in the first place. As a physics teacher, she understood that every action had consequences, ripples of cause and effect that extended far beyond the initial event. The discovery she'd made behind that false wall would create ripples that might grow into waves, affecting institutions, laws, and lives in ways she couldn't fully predict. But she also understood that truth, like energy, couldn't be created or destroyed, only transformed or transferred. Daniel had captured a truth too important to remain hidden. Now, it was her responsibility to ensure it reached those who could. Use it to create accountability and protect the rights Daniel had believed in so deeply. As dawn broke over the quiet suburban street, Rebecca checked the secure packages one final time, mentally reviewing her route to Portland and the precautions she would take to ensure she wasn't followed. In a few hours, she would meet Professor Weiss and take the first step toward transforming Daniel's solitary act of conscience into something that might create real change. She thought again of Zoe's scholarship essays on ethical challenges in engineering. Perhaps someday, when this was over, her daughter would understand the profound ethical choice Daniel had made. And the choice Rebecca now faced herself. Now, though, Rebecca's priority was protecting both the truth Daniel had risked everything to document and the daughter they had both lived for. The morning sun illuminated the workshop as Rebecca made final preparations, casting long shadows that seemed to connect the present moment to the hidden history she had uncovered. Whatever happened next, she would face it with clear eyes and firm resolve, honoring the man whose courage had set these events in motion and whose love had given her the strength to continue his work. The drive to Portland felt like crossing an invisible border between Rebecca's old life and whatever awaited on the other side of her decision. Sunday traffic moved steadily along the interstate, travelers oblivious to the encrypted flash drives secured in her purse or the weatherproof document packages concealed in a hidden compartment Daniel had built beneath the cargo area of their SUV, a modification she'd discovered only yesterday while following his contingency instructions. Rain began falling as the Portland skyline appeared on the horizon, droplets racing across the windshield like the thoughts cascading through Rebecca's mind. She'd taken elaborate precautions against surveillance, leaving her personal phone at home with Zoe, driving a circuitous route that included several deliberate detours, and stopping at a suburban mall parking garage to transfer to a rideshare service for the final approach to Lewis and Clark Law School. Professor Eleanor Weiss's office was located in the back corner of the law school's main building, with windows overlooking a wooded ravine rather than the campus, a detail Rebecca suspected was no accident for someone specializing in surveillance. Law and privacy rights. The professor herself matched her surroundings, understated but formidable, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple knot and penetrating grey eyes that assessed Rebecca with immediate intelligence. "Mrs. Lawson," she said, extending her hand after closing the office door. "No electronic devices as requested." "None," Rebecca confirmed. "And please, call me Rebecca." Professor Weiss nodded, then moved to a small control panel on her desk and activated what appeared to be a white noise generator. "TSCM sweep this morning confirmed the office is clean," she said, noting Rebecca's questioning look. "Technical surveillance countermeasures, a precaution I've found necessary in my line of work." The professor gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Your message suggested urgency and mentioned government surveillance documentation. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I can offer any meaningful guidance." Rebecca took a deep breath and began at the beginning. The discovery of the hidden room, Daniel's letter, and the documents revealing Project Sentinel's domestic surveillance operations. She explained Philip Mercer's unexpected visit and the veiled threat regarding Zoe, then detailed the steps she'd taken to secure both the physical and digital evidence. As she spoke, Professor Weiss took handwritten notes on a legal pad, her expression becoming increasingly grave. She asked occasional clarifying questions, specific program names, agencies involved, dates of operations, but otherwise listened with focused attention. "I've brought samples of the documentation," Rebecca concluded, reaching into her purse for one of the encrypted drives. "Everything Daniel collected is organized by program and date, with his analysis cross-referencing the raw documents." Professor Weiss accepted the drive with careful hands. "I'll need to review these materials in a secure environment before offering definitive advice. However, based on your description, it appears your husband documented exactly what many of us in the privacy advocacy community have long suspected. Domestic surveillance programs operating well beyond their legal authorization, targeting Americans for constitutionally protected activities. What are my options?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been consuming her thoughts since discovering the hidden room. Weiss leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Broadly speaking, you have 3 paths forward. First, you could turn everything over to official channels, the FBI's Internal Investigation Division or the Inspector General at the Department of Justice. This would be the most legally protected approach, but carries significant risk of the evidence being buried or minimized." She ticked off a second finger. "You could work with trusted journalists to make a public disclosure, a whistleblower approach similar to Edward Snowden's revelations, though potentially with better legal protection if handled correctly. This would ensure the information reaches the public, but would expose you to significant legal and personal risk. And the third option? Rebecca asked when Weiss paused. A hybrid approach, the professor said. Work simultaneously through legal channels, congressional oversight committees, and carefully selected journalists. Distribute the risk and create multiple paths for the information to emerge, making it harder for any single actor to suppress the revelations. Rebecca considered these options, each carrying different implications for her family's safety and the likelihood of meaningful reform resulting from Daniel's documentation. Before you decide, Weiss continued, there's another dimension to consider. Your late husband's employer, Western Communications Technologies, is a major defense contractor with significant government connections. The visit from Mr. Mercer suggests they're already aware something is missing. You and your daughter need protection, legal, physical, and reputational, before any disclosure occurs. The professor rose and walked to a bookshelf, retrieving what appeared to be a business card. James Harrington, she said, handing it to Rebecca, one of the best civil liberties attorneys in the country and someone I trust implicitly. Daniel's research identified him correctly as a potential ally. Rebecca accepted the card, recognizing the name from Daniel's contingency file. What about Maya Chen at the Oregon Sentinel? Daniel mentioned her as well. A good journalist with strong investigative credentials, Weiss confirmed. But before engaging any media, you need legal representation and a secure storage solution for the original documents. The evidence your husband collected has immense historical and legal significance. Its provenance and chain of custody must be impeccable to withstand the challenges that will inevitably follow. The professor returned to her desk, writing an address on a slip of paper. This is a private document preservation service in Washington, D.C., with experience handling sensitive whistleblower materials. They use blind trusts and multiple layers of security to protect both the documents and their clients' identities. I suggest transferring the originals there before proceeding further. Rebecca accepted the paper, the enormity of what she was undertaking settling over her like a physical weight. How do I protect Zoe through all this? She's already noticed. Something's wrong. Weiss's expression softened slightly. That depends on how you decide to proceed. Full anonymity is nearly impossible in cases of this magnitude. Eventually, investigative resources will identify the source. However, with proper legal preparation, your position as the widow who discovered the documents rather than the original collector provides some insulation. The professor checked her watch. I have a secure connection in my research lab where we can examine the files you've brought. That will help me provide more specific guidance based on exactly what your husband documented. They relocated to a small, windowless room in the basement of the law building, equipped with specialized computers isolated from the university network. For the next 2 hours, they methodically reviewed the digital archive Rebecca had created, with Professor Weiss occasionally taking handwritten notes or pointing out particularly significant documents. "This is extraordinary," she finally said, removing her reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. Your husband compiled what may be the most comprehensive documentation of extra-legal surveillance activities since the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s. The targeting parameters, the interagency coordination, the deliberate circumvention of oversight mechanisms, it's all here, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. What happens if this becomes public? Rebecca asked. Congressional investigations, criminal referrals, class action lawsuits, significant reforms to surveillance authorities, and, Weiss added with unflinching directness, extreme pressure on anyone associated with the disclosure. The agencies documented here have enormous resources and influence. They would use everything in their power to discredit the materials and their source. Rebecca nodded, having already intuited this reality. So I need to be absolutely certain before moving forward. You need to be prepared, Weiss corrected. Certainty about such complex matters is rarely possible. What you can do is ensure you've taken every reasonable precaution to protect yourself, your daughter, and the integrity of the evidence before irreversible steps are taken. As they prepared to leave the secure room, Weiss placed a hand on Rebecca's arm. There's something else you should consider. The timing of your husband's death relative to the most recent documents in his collection. You think they're connected? Rebecca asked, the question that had been haunting her since discovering the hidden room. I think coincidences are rare in matters involving national security, Weiss replied carefully. A heart attack can be entirely natural, or it can be induced through various means that are difficult to detect without specific testing. I'm not suggesting conspiracy theories, merely noting that caution is warranted given the significance of what your husband uncovered. The suggestion sent a chill through Rebecca. Daniel's death had seemed so straightforward, tragic, but not suspicious. His family history of heart problems had made the diagnosis immediately plausible to everyone, including Rebecca herself. Could there be more to the story? What would you do in my position? Rebecca asked as they returned to Weiss's office. The professor considered the question seriously. I would secure legal representation immediately. I would establish multiple secure backups of the evidence in locations not connected to me, and then I would work with the attorney to approach specific members of Congress known for their oversight of intelligence agencies, while simultaneously preparing for possible public disclosure through trusted media partners. She handed Rebecca a sealed envelope. Contact information for people I trust implicitly in each of those categories. Use the secure communication protocols your husband established when reaching out to them. Rebecca accepted the envelope, a plan beginning to crystallize in her mind. Thank you, Professor. You've given me a lot to consider. One more thing, Weiss said as Rebecca prepared to leave. Trust your instincts about who knows what. Your daughter is old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation, and keeping her completely in the dark might actually increase her risk rather than protecting her. She needs to be aware enough to recognize dangerous situations, even if you don't share all the details. The rain had intensified as Rebecca left the law school, using another rideshare service to return to the suburban mall where she'd left her vehicle. The professor's words about Daniel's death lingered, adding another layer of urgency to her decisions. If powerful people had been willing to silence Daniel, they wouldn't hesitate to move against her if they discovered she had his evidence. Before returning to Pinecrest, Rebecca made two crucial stops. First, she visited the private vault service Daniel had identified in his contingency plans, establishing an account under a limited liability company name provided in his instructions. There, she secured 2 of the 3 document packages, keeping one with her for immediate reference. Her second stop was to a specialized computer security store, where she purchased several items from the list in Daniel's files. A clean laptop with enhanced security features, encryption tools, and communication devices that would help protect her next steps from surveillance. As she finally turned onto the interstate toward home, Rebecca felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from the chaos of the past 2 days. The path forward remained dangerous and uncertain, but at least now, she understood the landscape she was navigating. Arriving home in the early evening, Rebecca found Zoe in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a role reversal that reflected her daughter's growing awareness that something significant was happening. "You were gone a long time," Zoe observed, stirring pasta sauce without looking up. "It took longer than I expected," Rebecca replied, setting her purse down carefully, the remaining document package and encrypted drive secure inside. Zoe turned, studying her mother's face with the same perceptive intensity Daniel had often shown when solving a complex problem. "Did you find what you needed in Portland?" "I found guidance," Rebecca said after a moment. "Zoe, we need to talk. After dinner." Her daughter nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "I know. That guy came back today, the one from Dad's company, said he forgot to leave some contact information. He was looking around a lot, especially toward the workshop." Rebecca's heart rate accelerated. "What did you tell him?" "That you were out running errands and I didn't know when you'd be back," Zoe replied. "He gave me his card and asked me to have you call him. Said it was increasingly important that you connect with him about Dad's work materials." The implied escalation was clear. Mercer was becoming more insistent, and involving Zoe directly increased the pressure on Rebecca to respond. They were running out of time for careful deliberation. After dinner, Rebecca made a decision. Taking Zoe into the living room, she explained a carefully edited version of what she had discovered, that Daniel had found evidence of potentially illegal government surveillance programs and had documented them before his death. She explained that his former employer was likely looking for this documentation and that certain precautions were now necessary. "Is that why you went to Portland? To get legal advice?" Zoe asked, quickly connecting the dots. "Yes," Rebecca confirmed. "I needed to understand what we're dealing with and what options we have." Zoe was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Do you think Dad's heart attack had something to do with this, with what he found?" The question, the same one Professor Weiss had raised, hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Of course Zoe would make that connection. She had her father's analytical mind and her mother's intuition. "I don't know," Rebecca answered honestly. "It's possible, but we may never know for certain. What matters now is protecting the truth. He worked to document and keeping ourselves safe in the process." "What can I do to help?" Zoe asked, her expression reflecting a maturity beyond her 19 years. Rebecca outlined basic security precautions, being careful about discussions in the house or over phones, watching for unfamiliar vehicles or people, maintaining normal routines as much as possible to avoid drawing attention. She didn't share all the details of her plans, believing that some measure of deniability might still protect Zoe if things went wrong. "Your scholarship applications and education remain the priority," Rebecca emphasized. "The best thing you can do is continue, focusing on your future while being aware of security concerns." Later that night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's remaining document package open before her. She had selected key materials based on Professor Weiss's guidance, documents that established the essential facts about Project Sentinel while minimizing exposure of sources and methods that might trigger national security prosecutions. Following the secure communication protocols Daniel had established, Rebecca reached out to James Harrington, the civil liberties attorney both Daniel and Professor Weiss had identified as trustworthy. Her message was brief and carefully worded, requesting an urgent consultation regarding documentation of domestic surveillance programs operating outside legal constraints. She included a secure contact method and the reference code Professor Weiss had provided to establish credibility. While waiting for a response, Rebecca turned her attention to preparing for contingencies she hoped would never materialize. Using Daniel's guidance, she assembled emergency kits with cash, alternate identification documents he had somehow acquired, prepaid phones, and essential supplies. She hid these in locations both in the house and in secure locations nearby, ensuring she and Zoe could access resources quickly if they needed to leave in a hurry. The quiet house amplified every sound, the refrigerator's hum, the occasional car passing outside, the subtle creaks of the structure settling for the night. Rebecca found herself checking the windows repeatedly, searching for signs of surveillance or more direct threats. The knowledge she now possessed had transformed ordinary nighttime noises into potential warnings, everyday occurrences into possible dangers. A response from Harrington arrived shortly before midnight, brief, direct, and reassuring. He would meet her the following afternoon at a private office he maintained separate from his main practice, specifically for sensitive clients. The address was in Salem, Oregon, close enough to reach easily, but far enough from both her home and Portland to reduce the chance of connection or surveillance. As Rebecca prepared for bed, her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. WCT security audit extending to all employee residences. Team will visit your location tomorrow at 10 a.m. to scan for missing technical materials. Compliance. Mandatory under Daniel's employment contract. Philip Mercer, Director of Security. The escalation was happening even faster than Professor Weiss had anticipated. Western Communications Technologies was done with subtle approaches and veiled threats. They were now moving to recover Daniel's documentation using the leverage of contractual obligations that might indeed give them legal authority to search for company property, though certainly not to seize evidence of potentially illegal activities. Rebecca forwarded the message to the secure contact Professor Weiss had provided, then began preparations for the confrontation that now appeared inevitable. She would need to balance multiple competing priorities, maintaining the appearance of cooperation to avoid immediate legal complications, protecting the most sensitive materials from discovery, and proceeding with her plans to engage legal representation before any public disclosure. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as she finally lay down to sleep. Daniel had carried this burden alone for months or perhaps years before his death. Now it had passed to her, the obligation to protect both the truth he had documented and the daughter they both loved. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, Rebecca found herself thinking about the physics principles she taught her students. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The surveillance apparatus Daniel had documented represented an enormous application of power, institutional, technological, financial. The reaction to that power, beginning with Daniel's solitary act of documentation and continuing through, whatever steps Rebecca would now take might seem small in comparison, but physics also taught that leverage could amplify force, that systems had tipping points where small inputs could create disproportionate effects. The evidence Daniel had collected, properly applied, might create exactly that kind of leverage, a fulcrum upon which the weight of public opinion, legal accountability, and constitutional principles could be brought to bear against even the most powerful institutions. Tomorrow would bring direct confrontation with those who wanted to recover and suppress Daniel's documentation. Rebecca would face them with the strength that comes from clarity of purpose and the courage that comes from fighting for something larger than oneself, the same courage that had driven Daniel to create his archive in the first place. At precisely 10 a.m., a black SUV and a white van with the Western Communications Technologies logo pulled into Rebecca's driveway. From her position at the kitchen window, she watched 4 people emerge. Philip Mercer, 2 men carrying equipment, cases who appeared to be technical specialists, and a woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio who Rebecca immediately identified as legal counsel. "Showtime," she murmured to herself, squaring her shoulders. The night had brought clarity through preparation. After receiving Mercer's text, Rebecca had worked methodically until dawn, implementing a strategy built on Professor Weiss's guidance and Daniel's contingency plans. The most sensitive documents were now secured off-site. The remaining materials were strategically distributed where they would be difficult to discover without a destructive search that would reveal the true nature of WCT's interest. Most importantly, Rebecca had documented everything, creating a detailed record of WCT's escalating efforts to recover Daniel's evidence, including Mercer's initial casual visit, the text message demanding access, and now the team arriving with equipment clearly designed for a technical sweep rather than a simple document recovery. Zoe had left early for a scheduled meeting with her academic advisor, her absence a deliberate part of Rebecca's strategy to shield her daughter from this confrontation. Before leaving, Zoe had hugged her mother tightly, slipping a note into Rebecca's hand that read simply, "Dad would be proud of you, I am too." Those words now fortified Rebecca as she opened the front door before Mercer could ring the bell, meeting the security director's surprised expression with calm professionalism. "Mr. Mercer," she acknowledged, "I received your message. Rather sudden for a routine audit." Mercer recovered quickly, offering a practiced smile that reminded Rebecca of a nature documentary she'd once seen about predators. "Mrs. Lawson, thank you for accommodating us. This is Claire Donovan from our legal department and technicians Adams and Rivera. The audit shouldn't take more than a couple of hours." Rebecca nodded, maintaining the appearance of reluctant cooperation. "I understand Daniel's employment agreement may give you certain rights to recover company property, but I'd like to see the specific provision you're operating under." The attorney stepped forward, opening her portfolio. "Of course. Section 12(3) of the Proprietary Information and Inventions Agreement covers company property, including technical documentation, and specifically allows for recovery efforts in the event of employment termination, including by death." Rebecca accepted the document, scanning it carefully. The language was indeed broad, potentially covering a search for company materials, though certainly not authorizing the seizure of evidence documenting illegal activities. "I see," Rebecca said, returning the agreement. "And what exactly are you looking for? I've been reorganizing the workshop for weeks and haven't come across anything that appears to be company property." "Technical documentation primarily," Mercer replied smoothly, "often stored on drives or in folders that might not be immediately identifiable as company materials to someone without context. Our team will be able to identify anything that belongs to WCT." Rebecca stepped back, gesturing toward the interior. "Of the house? Then by all means, conduct your audit. I'll accompany you throughout, of course." "That won't be necessary," Mercer began, but Rebecca cut him off firmly. "It wasn't a question, Mr. Mercer. This is my home, and I'll be present for any search conducted within it. I'm sure Ms. Donovan can confirm that's my right." The attorney nodded reluctantly. "Mrs. Lawson is entitled to observe the audit process." The technical team moved first to Daniel's workshop, setting up equipment that Rebecca recognized from Daniel's documentation as signal detection tools designed to locate electronic storage devices and identify shielded spaces. She watched with careful neutrality as they methodically swept the main workshop area, their equipment occasionally emitting soft beeps as it detected standard electronic components in Daniel's tools and equipment. When they approached the shelving unit concealing the hidden room, Rebecca held her breath. She had removed all of Daniel's documentation and equipment, but the RF shielding built into the walls would likely trigger their detectors. As expected, the equipment emitted a more urgent series of beeps as it passed near the disguised door. "We're getting strong readings here," one of the technicians reported to Mercer, "consistent with RF shielding." Mercer turned to Rebecca, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Lawson, are you aware of any shielded areas in this workshop?" Rebecca allowed a moment of apparent hesitation before responding. "Daniel converted that shelving unit into a door at some point. There's a small room behind it that he used for testing sensitive electronics. He mentioned something about preventing interference." "And you didn't think to mention this when I visited yesterday?" Mercer's tone had lost all pretense of friendliness. "You asked about work materials, not workshop modifications," Rebecca replied evenly. "I'm still discovering things about how Daniel organized his space." Mercer gestured impatiently for the technicians to open the hidden door. They examined the disguised mechanism for several minutes before figuring out how to release it, swinging the shelving unit outward to reveal the now empty room behind. The space appeared exactly as Rebecca had arranged it, stripped of all documentation and equipment, but with the RF shielding still visibly lining the walls. A single desk remained, its drawers empty, with a framed family photograph placed prominently. On its surface, Mercer surveyed the empty room with poorly concealed frustration. "What was stored in here?" "I have no idea," Rebecca replied truthfully. "The room was empty when I discovered it 2 days ago, except for the desk and photograph. I assumed Daniel had removed whatever he was working on before his death." The technical team conducted a thorough sweep of the hidden room, their equipment, detecting nothing beyond the RF shielding built into the walls. Rebecca watched the growing tension in Mercer's posture as each area of the workshop yielded nothing of significance. The search continued through the house, with the team examining Daniel's former office, the bedroom closets, and various storage areas. Their equipment occasionally detected standard electronic devices, computers, routers, entertainment systems, but nothing triggering the specific alerts they were clearly hoping for. Throughout the process, Rebecca maintained her role as the cooperative but watchful widow, asking occasional questions about what they were looking for and why certain areas seemed to interest them more than others. The technical team grew increasingly uncomfortable under her observation, while Mercer's frustration manifested in clipped responses and thinly veiled accusations. "Mrs. Lawson," he finally said as the team prepared to examine the garage, "we have reason to believe your husband removed sensitive materials from our facility. The nature of these materials makes this a potential national security concern. If you're withholding information about their location, the consequences could be severe for you and your daughter." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Mercer, I've cooperated fully with your audit. I've allowed your team access to my entire home based on a contractual provision that seems increasingly stretched beyond its intended purpose. If you have specific allegations to make, perhaps you should do so formally through appropriate legal channels rather than making veiled threats against my family." The attorney, who had been monitoring the exchange with growing concern, stepped forward. "Philip, a word, please." They stepped aside for a hushed conversation that Rebecca couldn't quite hear, though the attorney's expression suggested she was warning Mercer about legal exposure. When they returned, the attorney addressed Rebecca directly. "Mrs. Lawson, we apologize for any discomfort this process has caused. We're simply trying to recover company property that may have been inadvertently retained." "Of course," Rebecca replied, her tone making it clear she recognized the facade for what it was. "I understand completely." The garage search proved as fruitless as the rest of the house, and by early afternoon, the technical team was packing up their equipment while Mercer conferred again with the attorney. Rebecca maintained her position of watchful cooperation, signing the inventory form they presented, showing that no company materials had been recovered during the search. As the team prepared to leave, Mercer made one final attempt. "Mrs. Lawson, if you should discover any materials related to your husband's work at WCT, particularly any documentation related to government contracts, I urge you to contact me immediately. These could be matters of national security. I'll certainly keep that in mind," Rebecca replied, holding the door as they exited. She watched from the porch as they loaded their equipment and drove away, maintaining her composed expression until they turned the corner at the end of the street. Only then Did she allow herself to release the breath she'd been holding and acknowledge the trembling in her hands? The confrontation had confirmed what Professor Weiss had suggested. Western communications technologies was desperately searching for Daniel's documentation, employing thinly veiled threats and stretching legal authorities to their breaking point. The company's actions validated the significance of what Daniel had uncovered and reinforced the need for Rebecca to proceed with her plans quickly. Checking the time, Rebecca gathered what she needed for her meeting with James Harrington in Salem. She had just over an hour to make the drive, and every minute now felt precious. As she locked the house, she noticed an unmarked sedan parked down the street, not one of the vehicles that had brought the WCT team, but positioned with a clear view of her house. They were maintaining surveillance, likely hoping she would lead them to the materials they couldn't find during their search. Rebecca smiled slightly as she got into her car. Daniel had anticipated this scenario in his contingency plans, providing detailed instructions for counter-surveillance techniques. Following these instructions, Rebecca drove a carefully planned route that included several opportunities to identify and evade followers, quick turns on yellow lights, last-minute exits from highways, and routes through parking garages that offered multiple exit options. By the time she reached the nondescript office building in Salem, where Harrington had arranged to meet her, Rebecca was confident she had shed any surveillance. The attorney was waiting in a small conference room, his reputation for brilliance evident in the intensity of his gaze, as he analyzed her situation with methodical precision. "Professor Weiss briefed me on the general contours," he said after introductions, "but I need to understand exactly what documentation your husband collected and what steps you've already taken." Rebecca provided a detailed account from her discovery of the hidden room through the WCT search that morning. She explained the distribution of the physical documents across multiple secure locations and showed him samples of the digital archive on one of the encrypted drives. Harrington reviewed the materials with growing interest, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions about specific programs or targeting parameters. After nearly an hour of examination, he set down his pen and looked directly at Rebecca. "What your husband documented appears to be a massive overreach of surveillance authorities, systematically targeting Americans for constitutionally protected activities under the guise of national security. If authenticated and properly contextualized, these materials could trigger the most significant intelligence oversight investigation since the Church Committee in the 1970s. "What's our next step?" Rebecca asked. "We need to establish legal protection for you and your daughter immediately," Harrington replied. "Then secure the complete documentation with proper chain of custody verification before approaching key congressional oversight figures. Simultaneous with the congressional approach, we prepare for potential public disclosure through carefully selected media partners." He outlined a comprehensive strategy that balanced multiple objectives: legal protection, physical security, evidentiary preservation, and maximum impact for reform. The plan would require Rebecca to temporarily relocate while the initial congressional contacts were established, a precaution against both legal pressure and more direct threats. "What about my job? Zoe's college?" Rebecca asked, the practical concerns of their lives asserting themselves alongside the larger issues at stake. "We'll need cover stories that explain your temporary absence without raising suspicions," Harrington acknowledged. "A family emergency requiring travel is often effective. For Zoe, maintaining her academic progress is actually helpful. It creates normalcy that helps counter any suggestion that you're acting from anything other than civic duty." By the time their meeting concluded, Rebecca had a clear roadmap for the coming weeks: specific actions, security protocols, and legal preparations that would maximize the impact of Daniel's documentation while minimizing the risks to her family. Harrington would begin preparation of legal filings that could be activated immediately if authorities moved against her, while simultaneously establishing connections with trusted congressional staff who could shepherd the evidence into proper oversight channels. "What you're doing takes immense courage," Harrington said, as they prepared to part ways. "Your husband began this journey alone, documenting abuses others chose to ignore. By continuing his work, you're not just honoring his memory, you're defending principles fundamental to our democracy." The attorney's words stayed with Rebecca as she drove home, taking another carefully planned route to detect and evade any surveillance. The unmarked sedan was gone from her street when she arrived, but she remained vigilant, watching for any signs of observation as she entered the house. Zoe returned shortly after, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "How did it go with the company people?" she asked immediately. "About as expected," Rebecca replied, giving her daughter a carefully edited summary of the search and its aftermath. "They didn't find what they were looking for, but they're not giving up. And your meeting afterward?" Zoe's perceptiveness continued to impress Rebecca. She hadn't told her daughter about the appointment with Harrington, but Zoe had clearly deduced that Rebecca's absence had a purpose beyond avoiding the aftermath of the WCT search. "I met with an attorney who specializes in cases like this," Rebecca acknowledged. "He's helping me navigate the legal complexities and develop a plan for handling Dad's documentation appropriately." Zoe nodded, seeming satisfied with this explanation. "What can I do to help?" The question reflected the same courage and commitment that had driven Daniel's actions, the willingness to stand for principle even at personal cost. Rebecca felt a surge of pride mixed with protective concern. "For now, maintain your normal routine, focus on your studies, your scholarship applications, your future," Rebecca advised. "There may come a point where we need to make temporary changes to our living situation, but the attorney believes you're continuing your education normally is actually helpful to our position." Over dinner, they discussed practical preparations, what documents and personal items would be essential if they needed to leave quickly, how to communicate securely if separated, where to meet if normal channels were compromised. Throughout the conversation, Zoe displayed the analytical thinking she'd inherited from Daniel, identifying potential weaknesses in their plans and suggesting practical solutions. "Dad taught me to always have backup systems for critical functions," she noted when they discussed communication protocols. "We should have at least 3 independent ways to contact each other that don't rely on our normal phones or accounts." Later that evening, as Rebecca finalized preparations for the next phase of their plan, her secure phone, one of Daniel's devices recovered from the hidden room, received a message from an encrypted contact she recognized as Professor Weiss. "WCT filed sealed court action today seeking emergency order to recover stolen classified materials from your residence. Judge likely to rule tomorrow. Accelerate timeline." The warning confirmed what Rebecca had already intuited. Western communications technologies was escalating through legal channels, using classification authorities to create a pretext for seizing Daniel's documentation. Once such materials were in government hands, they could be buried indefinitely through national security exemptions to transparency laws. Rebecca immediately contacted Harrington, who confirmed the information through his sources and accelerated their countermeasures. "Be ready to move by morning," he advised. "I'm activating our congressional contacts tonight and preparing the protective legal filings. The documentation needs to reach oversight authorities before any seizure order can be executed." As midnight approached, Rebecca and Zoe completed their final preparations, essential items packed in inconspicuous bags, emergency funds secured, communication protocols established. Throughout the process, Rebecca marveled at her daughter's composure in the face of such extraordinary circumstances. "You're handling this remarkably well," she observed, as they finalized their preparations. Zoe looked up from the secure phone. She was configuring according to Daniel's instructions. Dad always said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. This is right. What he documented, what you're protecting, it matters. And the simple conviction in her daughter's voice crystallized something Rebecca had been feeling throughout this journey. Daniel's documentation wasn't just evidence of governmental overreach. It was a testament to the fundamental American principle that power must be accountable to law, that constitutional rights couldn't be sacrificed on the altar of security. Theater, that truth mattered even when powerful interests preferred it remain hidden. Shortly before dawn, Rebecca's secure phone chimed with the message they'd been waiting for. "Transport arranged. Proceed to secondary location. Congressional contact secured." As the first light of morning illuminated their quiet suburban street, Rebecca and Zoe loaded their essential belongings into the car. There was no sign of surveillance, but Rebecca remained vigilant, following the route Harrington had arranged to minimize exposure. Their destination was a private airfield outside Salem, where a small plane waited to transport them to Washington, D.C. There, they would meet with trusted congressional staff, while Harrington's team filed their protective legal actions and prepared for the public disclosure phase of their strategy. As they drove away from the house that had been their home, Rebecca glanced at her daughter in the passenger seat, determined, focused, and displaying the same moral courage that had driven Daniel to create his documentation in the first place. "Are you ready for this?" Rebecca asked softly. Zoe nodded, her expression resolute. "Dad started something important. We're going to finish it." The journey ahead remained uncertain, filled with legal, personal, and security challenges that would test them both. But in that moment, Rebecca felt a profound clarity about their path forward. Daniel's discovery behind that false wall had set these events in motion, but it was their choices now, their courage, their determination, their commitment to truth that would determine the impact of what he had documented. As they approached the airfield, Rebecca thought about the physics principles she taught her students, how energy transforms but is never destroyed, how seemingly small forces can change the trajectory of much larger systems when applied at the right point with the right leverage. Daniel had created that leverage through years of meticulous documentation. Now Rebecca and Zoe would apply it, transforming one man's solitary act of conscience into a force for accountability and reform that even the most powerful agencies couldn't easily suppress. The small plane waited on the tarmac, its pilot completing pre-flight checks as they arrived. Within minutes they were airborne, rising above the landscape of their familiar lives toward an uncertain but purposeful future. 3 months after Rebecca Lawson discovered the hidden room behind the false wall in her late husband's workshop, she sat in a congressional hearing room, watching as the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee questioned senior intelligence officials about the domestic surveillance programs Daniel had documented. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. Western communications technologies had indeed secured a sealed court order authorizing seizure of classified materials from Rebecca's residence, only to find the house empty and the documentation already secured through proper legal channels with congressional oversight committees. The company had then attempted to discredit both Daniel and Rebecca, suggesting mental health issues, financial motivations, and even foreign influence. Tactics documented in Daniel's files as standard responses to whistleblowers. But the evidence itself, meticulously organized and cross-referenced, had withstood every challenge to its authenticity and significance. Working with Harrington's legal team and trusted journalists at major publications, Rebecca had navigated a carefully orchestrated disclosure process that balanced national security considerations with the public's right to know about unconstitutional surveillance targeting American citizens. The result had been a series of explosive revelations that prompted emergency congressional hearings, Inspector General investigations across multiple agencies, and a presidential directive ordering immediate review of all domestic surveillance authorities. As Rebecca listened to senators from both parties express outrage over the targeting parameters and lack of oversight documented in Daniel's files, she felt his presence beside her, his meticulous attention to detail, his moral courage, his fundamental belief that systems of power must be accountable to the people they ostensibly serve. Zoe sat beside her in the hearing room, having taken a semester's leave from her engineering program to support her mother through this process. The experience had transformed her academic focus, inspiring a new concentration in ethics and governance, of technology that combined her technical abilities with the moral clarity she'd inherited from both her parents. When the hearing concluded, Rebecca and Zoe walked together down the Capitol steps, where journalists waited to capture their reaction to the day's testimony. "Mrs. Lawson, do you feel vindicated by today's admissions from intelligence officials?" one reporter called out. Rebecca paused, considering her response carefully. "This was never about vindication. My husband documented these programs because he believed Americans deserve both security and constitutional rights, not a false choice between them. Today's hearing represents a step toward restoring proper oversight and accountability, but the work is far from complete." Another journalist pressed forward. "What would you say to other potential whistleblowers who might be witnessing similar abuses?" Rebecca glanced at Zoe, drawing strength from her daughter's resolute expression before responding. "I would say that courage often begins with a single choice to document what others prefer remain hidden. My husband made that choice alone, creating a record of truth that powerful interests tried desperately to suppress. But truth has a persistence that secrecy lacks. It waits to be discovered, to be protected, to be amplified by those willing to stand for principle, even when doing so carries cost." As they walked away from the Capitol, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had begun in Daniel's workshop just months ago. A journey from private grief to public purpose, from isolated documentation to systematic reform. The hidden room behind, the false wall, had contained more than evidence of surveillance overreach. It had contained a challenge to become worthy of difficult truths and a reminder that democracy requires ordinary citizens willing to defend its foundational principles. The work ahead remained substantial. Congressional oversight would need to be sustained, reforms implemented and monitored, legal protections for future whistleblowers strengthened. But in transforming Daniel's solitary act of conscience into a catalyst for meaningful change, Rebecca and Zoe had honored both the man they had lost and the principles he had sacrificed to defend. "Ready to head home?" Zoe asked as they reached the car that would take them back to their temporary residence in Washington. Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of the past months alongside the hope that had emerged from their darkest moments. Home had become a fluid concept, no longer just a physical place, but a commitment to truth, to family, to the courage required when principles are tested. As the car pulled away from the Capitol, Rebecca watched the dome recede in the distance, a symbol of the democratic institutions Daniel had sought to protect through his meticulous documentation. The false wall in his workshop had concealed not just evidence of governmental overreach, but a profound legacy of moral courage, a legacy now continued through Rebecca and Zoe's own choices to stand for truth when easier paths beckoned. The discovery behind that false wall had changed everything, setting in motion consequences that would continue to unfold long after today's hearing. But the most profound change had occurred within Rebecca herself, transforming a grieving widow into a determined advocate, revealing reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed until circumstances demanded them. In physics, Rebecca had always taught her students that transformation was governed by fundamental laws: conservation of energy, momentum, the relationship between force and mass. But Daniel's hidden documentation had revealed another kind of a transformation, how truth, protected and amplified by those willing to stand for principle, could become a force capable of changing even the most powerful systems. 2 years after Rebecca Lawson discovered the hidden room behind the false wall in her husband's workshop, she stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The audience before her represented a cross-section of American civic life: journalists, legal scholars, privacy advocates, congressional staffers, and ordinary citizens drawn together by the anniversary of what had come to be known simply as the Sentinel Disclosures. When my husband Daniel built that hidden room, Rebecca began, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment, he couldn't have known that his solitary act of documentation would ultimately lead to the most significant intelligence reform legislation in half a century. He was simply one engineer who chose to record the truth when he discovered systems operating beyond their legal constraints. The journey from that first shocking discovery to this moment had transformed not just American surveillance policy, but Rebecca herself. The high school physics teacher who had once struggled to make ends meet now directed the newly established Lawson Center for Technology, Ethics and Governance, an independent watchdog organization founded with a portion of the whistleblower award Daniel's documentation had eventually generated. The Intelligence Oversight Reform Act, signed into law last month, represents a fundamental recommitment to constitutional principles, Rebecca continued. Real judicial review of surveillance applications, meaningful congressional oversight with actual technical expertise, protection for those who report abuses through proper channels. And perhaps most importantly, a clear statement that security and liberty are complementary values, not competing interests to be traded against each other. From her seat in the front row, Zoe watched her mother with evident pride. Now 21, and in her final year of engineering studies, she had emerged from the tumultuous events following their discovery with a crystallized sense of purpose. Her senior thesis, developing technical safeguards against unauthorized surveillance, had already attracted attention from privacy-focused technology companies and civil liberties organizations. But legislation alone cannot sustain the delicate balance between security and freedom, Rebecca emphasized, her gaze moving across the audience. Laws require vigilance, from courts willing to scrutinize government claims, from legislators who prioritize oversight beyond camera-ready hearings, from media who investigate beyond official statements, and from citizens who engage with complex issues rather than accepting simple narratives of fear. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. After the initial congressional hearings, Western communications technologies had launched aggressive legal challenges to block release of Daniel's documentation, citing national security concerns. Intelligence agencies had pushed for maximum redaction of any public disclosures, while simultaneously working through back-channel connections to minimize the impact of potential reforms. What had ultimately broken the resistance was the meticulous nature of Daniel's evidence combined with Rebecca's strategic approach to disclosure. Working with Harrington's legal team and Professor Weiss's academic network, they had systematically released documentation through multiple channels: congressional oversight committees, inspector general investigations, and carefully vetted media partners. Each disclosure had been calibrated to protect genuine national security concerns, while exposing clear abuses of authority. By distributing the evidence across multiple pathways, they had ensured that no single bottleneck could suppress the complete picture Daniel had documented. The question I'm asked most frequently, Rebecca continued, is whether the personal cost was worth it. The disruption to our lives, the legal challenges, the character attacks, the financial uncertainty before the whistleblower protections were affirmed. Would we choose this path again, knowing what we know now? She paused, her gaze finding Zoe in the audience before continuing. The answer is unequivocally yes, because the alternative, silence in the face of fundamental constitutional violations, would have betrayed not just my husband's courage, but the very principles that define our democracy. When we discovered what Daniel had documented, the question was never whether we should act, but how we could act most effectively to protect both the truth and ourselves through the process. The journey had indeed exacted costs. For 6 months, after the initial disclosures, Rebecca and Zoe had lived under security protection, moving between safe locations as legal battles raged and investigations unfolded. Rebecca had taken an extended leave from teaching, while Zoe had transferred to complete her coursework remotely during the most intense period of media scrutiny and legal challenges. Their suburban home in Pinecrest had been sold. Too many. Memories mingled with security concerns made returning impractical. They had ultimately settled in a different state, in a house with advanced security features that had once seemed paranoid but now felt simply prudent. Yet alongside these costs had come unexpected forms of resolution. The formal investigation into the circumstances of Daniel's death had confirmed what Rebecca had suspected since discovering his documentation. His heart attack had been chemically induced, a sophisticated method designed to appear natural given his family history of cardiovascular issues. The investigation had identified 3 former intelligence contractors working for a specialized unit within Western Communications Technologies, revealing an operation designed to eliminate security risks that operated with minimal oversight. Criminal charges against these individuals were proceeding through the court system, while civil lawsuits against WCT had resulted in substantial settlements for families of targeted whistleblowers. What my husband began alone in that hidden workshop, we continued together as a family, and now extends to all of you, Rebecca told the audience. The work of safeguarding both security and liberty is never complete. It requires constant vigilance, technical expertise, legal framework, and most importantly, the moral courage to stand for principle when expedience offers easier paths. As she concluded her remarks to sustained applause, Rebecca reflected on how thoroughly their lives had been transformed by what they had found behind that false wall. The documents themselves, now secured in the National Archives with Rebecca and Zoe designated as their official custodians, had become recognized as historically significant records of a critical moment in American governance. The reception following her speech brought together many who had played crucial roles in the journey. James Harrington, whose legal brilliance had navigated unprecedented complexities. Professor Weiss, whose academic network had helped authenticate and contextualize Daniel's documentation. Maya Chen, whose investigative reporting had broken key aspects of the story at critical moments. And congressional staffers whose behind-the-scenes work had transformed public outrage into meaningful legislation. "Your mother is extraordinary," Professor Weiss observed to Zoe as they watched Rebecca engaged in animated conversation with a group of law students. "The transformation from that first meeting in my office to the national leader she's become, it's remarkable." "She always had it in her," Zoe replied. Dad used to say she was the strongest person he knew, even though she never saw it herself. She just needed the right catalyst. The professor nodded thoughtfully. That's often how moral courage works. It lies dormant until circumstances demand its expression. The question is never whether the capacity exists, but whether it will be summoned when needed. Across the room, Rebecca found herself in conversation with Senator Catherine Winters, the Intelligence Committee chair who had championed the reform legislation against significant resistance from entrenched interests. The implementation phase is where the real challenges begin, the senator confided. The agencies are already looking for workarounds, new interpretations that would preserve old practices under new names. We need your center's independent technical assessment of the compliance measures they're proposing. We're already analyzing the initial frameworks, Rebecca assured her. Our technical team has identified several areas where the proposed implementation falls short of the legislation's requirements. We'll have a comprehensive assessment ready before the oversight hearing next month. The senator studied her with evident respect. When you first came to my office with those documents, I thought you were either extraordinarily brave or remarkably naive. I couldn't imagine how a high school physics teacher and her college student daughter could possibly navigate the forces that would align against you. Rebecca smiled. I was probably both brave and naive. But I had something more important than experience. I had truth meticulously documented, principles worth defending, and eventually allies willing to stand with us when it mattered most. Later that evening, after the formal events concluded, Rebecca and Zoe returned to their hotel suite overlooking the Washington Monument. As the city lights created a tapestry of illumination against the darkening sky, they shared a quiet moment of reflection that had become their tradition on significant anniversary dates. Dad would be proud, Zoe said softly, gazing out at the monument. Not just of what we accomplished with his documentation, but how we did it, the principles we maintained throughout the process. Rebecca nodded, remembering Daniel as he had been, methodical, principled, quietly determined. He gave us everything we needed to finish what he started, not just the evidence, but the ethical framework, the security protocols, the contingency plans. He thought of everything except his own protection. That was Dad, Zoe said with a sad smile, always focused on the systems, the principles, the larger picture. It's why I'm redesigning his security model for my thesis project, so the next person who documents abuses has better protection protocols than he created for himself. Rebecca watched her daughter with profound appreciation. Zoe had emerged from their ordeal not defeated or embittered, but strengthened and focused, channeling her technical abilities and her father's ethical framework into creating safeguards for future truth-tellers. The trauma they had experienced had been transformed into purpose, grief into determination. I've been thinking about your graduation, Rebecca said after a moment, about what comes next for both of us. Zoe turned from the window. You've had an offer, haven't you? I can always tell when you've got something significant on your mind. Rebecca smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. Several, actually. The Georgetown Law Center wants me to teach a course on technology ethics and whistleblower protection. Harvard's Kennedy School has proposed a visiting fellowship focused on intelligence oversight reform. And there's a growing movement to nominate me for the new Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board.